The land did not forgive. That was the first thing anyone learned living on the northern plains of Dakota Territory. Not in the towns, not in the schoolhouses, not from any book carried west in a wagon. You learned it from the land itself, from the way it stretched without apology in every direction, flat and indifferent, offering nothing to hold the eye, nothing to slow the wind, nothing to suggest that human presence had ever mattered or ever would. The sky above it was enormous in a way that made a person feel not inspired but exposed. And the wind was the truest thing about this place. It came from the northwest like a judgment, and it did not stop. People came anyway. They came because the land was cheap and the promise was simple work it and it will feed you. What the promise left out was the other half of the agreement. The land would feed you, and the land would also kill you if you gave it the chance. Most people only learn that second part once. Clara Voss had learned it 14 months ago. She was standing at the cabin window on a Tuesday morning in late October 1887, watching the frost work its way across the glass, from the edges inward, the way it always did, the way it had done every autumn since she and Thomas had built this place 9 years before. The fields were finished. The last of the corn had been pulled and stored 3 weeks ago. The hay was in. The animals were settling into their winter patterns, eating less moving, less conserving in the way that living things do when they understand that what is coming will require everything they have. Clara was 51 years old. She had brown hair gone mostly gray at the temples, hands that showed every year of the work she had done, and eyes that people sometimes described as unsettling because they did not look away when looking away would have been more comfortable. She was not a large woman, but she carried herself with a kind of density as if more weight existed in her than her frame suggested. She did not speak often. When she did, it mattered. Thomas had been gone for 14 months. She did not think about him every moment. That was something people assumed about grief, that it was constant and unbroken pressure. It was not. It came in specific shapes attached to specific things. The weight of the axe in her hand, because his hands had shaped the grip, smooth over years of use. The sound the cabin door made when the wind hit it from the east, because he had meant to fix the latch that last autumn and never did. The distance between the cabin door and the silo door. 18 steps. That was the distance. She had counted it the morning after they found him because she needed to understand the number. Not the cold, not the storm. The disorientation that the storm created, the way white erased direction and turned 18 familiar steps into an unmarked wilderness. Thomas Voss had walked out of this cabin on the night of January 14th, 1886, in a storm that had closed the world to a radius of 6 feet, and he had not been able to find his way back. She had driven a post into the ground at the place where they found him. Not as a grave marker, Thomas was buried in the churchyard 2 miles east. As a measurement, as a reminder of the specific distance at which the familiar became fatal. She looked at that post now through the frosted window. It stood between the cabin and the silo, roughly at the midpoint of the distance, leaning slightly to the southeast, the way all posts eventually leaned in the soil. She had carved his name into it. She had carved the date. She had carved the number. Thomas Voss, January 14th, 1886, 18 steps. Then she turned from the window, put on her coat, and went outside to begin. The first thing she cut was willow. There was a stand of it along the creek bed a quarter-mile north, the kind that grew low and flexible, sending up long, straight shoots each spring that could be cut and bent without splitting. She had studied it for most of the summer, watching how it moved in wind, how it bent without breaking, how the shoots returned to shape after pressure was removed. She cut 50 shoots on the first morning, carried them back over her shoulder, laid them in the yard, and began measuring. The distance from the cabin door to the silo door was between 52 and 60 feet, depending on the size of the stride. She measured it with a length of rope marked at 1-foot intervals with knots. Then she walked it again slowly with her eyes closed, counting her own steps. Feeling the ground beneath her feet, noting where it rose slightly near the silo foundation, where it held moisture longer after rain, where the wind moved differently because of the angle of the silo wall. She was not building a wall. She was not building a windbreak in the traditional sense, the solid barrier that broke wind by stopping it. She had watched what solid barriers did in this climate. Snow built against them on the windward side until the pressure became structural, and either the barrier broke or the snow simply rose above it and continued. Solid things failed here. She had seen it enough times to understand it as a principle, not an exception. She was building something that would interrupt the wind, redirect it, steal from it gradually the way a river loses speed moving through marsh grass, not blocked but slowed its energy dispersed across 1,000 small resistances rather than met by one large one. She drove the first stakes on a line that was not quite straight. This was the detail that would draw the most attention, later, the most confusion, the most mockery. The line of the tunnel curved slightly, bending perhaps 4 degrees to the south at its midpoint before straightening again near the silo. It followed a logic that was invisible to anyone who had not spent a summer watching how wind moved across this specific piece of ground. The prevailing winds came from the northwest in winter, but wind did not travel in straight lines when it encountered structures. It moved around them through gaps along edges, finding paths of least resistance the way water did. Clara had watched the movement of dust and chaff and snow across her yard for 3 seasons, had tied lengths of yarn to stakes at different heights and tracked how they moved in different conditions, had noted which corners of which buildings accumulated the most drifted snow and why. The curve of the tunnel was not aesthetic. It was the result of 200 mornings of observation translated into a single structural decision. She did not explain this to anyone. There was no point. Explanation requires a listener who is prepared to receive it. What she encountered instead, beginning on the 3rd morning of construction, was Cutter Marsh. Cutter Marsh was 34 years old, broad across the shoulders, and possessed of the particular confidence that comes from never having been seriously wrong about anything that mattered. He farmed 2 sections of land north of Clara's property with his younger brother Bram, and he rode a gray horse that he handled well, which was the best thing that could be said about him on most days. He came along the fence line at a walk the way men did when they wanted to appear as though they were simply passing. He stopped. He looked at the half-built frame of bent willow ribs, at the pattern of woven branches beginning to fill the spaces between them, at the shape forming in the air between the cabin door and the silo. "What is that?" he said. "A passage," Clara said. She did not look up from her work. "A passage," Cutter repeated. He turned in his saddle as if checking whether anyone else was witnessing this. "Between the cabin and the silo?" "Yes," he laughed. Not a short sound, not polite, but the full expression of a man encountering something he found genuinely absurd. "You're building a woven tunnel out of sticks." "Because the distance is too dangerous to cross in a storm," she said. "The distance is 60 feet. Yes. My grandmother crossed 60 feet in a blizzard. And if she had not made it," Clara said, still not looking up, "someone would have built something." Cutter watched her work for another minute. Then he said, well, in the way men say it, when they have decided to leave, but want the last sound to belong to them. He turned his horse and rode north. By evening, the story had traveled. Clara knew this because of the way the following morning felt that particular quality of attention that settles over a place when it has become the subject of discussion. What they were saying was some version of this: the Voss widow was building something strange, something that might be grief made visible, or isolation made structural, or simply the project of a woman who had been alone too long with her own thoughts. Gideon Deller heard it too. He farmed 2 miles south, a practical man in his 40s who made decisions based on what he could see and touch and measure, and who had no patience for what he called borrowed ideas, systems copied from someone else, without understanding why they worked. He did not come to look, not yet, but he noted what he heard the way practical men note things they do not yet have a use for but are not quite ready to dismiss. Clara worked through the morning without interruption. Then just after midday, she heard a horse. Eli Strand came alone. He was 60 years old or close enough that the difference didn't matter, with a face shaped by decades of weather into something that looked more carved than grown. He had come to Dakota Territory in 1872 from Ohio after years she did not know much about, except that they had included the war and whatever the war had done to him. He did not speak of it. What he carried from that time was visible in the way he moved deliberately without wasted motion, and in the way he looked at things, not at their surface, but through them, at their structure, their weaknesses, the places where they were likely to fail. He had been Thomas's closest neighbor, and in the careful way that men of that generation form such things, something like a friend, he dismounted at the fence line and walked toward the structure without speaking. He went to it the way a man goes to something he intends to evaluate, not admire. He pressed his palm flat against the woven side and pushed. The structure moved, flexed, absorbed the pressure, and returned. He walked its length. He studied the curve. He crouched at one point and looked along the base, checking the stake depth, the angle of the supports. He stood and looked at the space inside the way light moved through the weave, the gaps that remained the places where the layers had been doubled. Clara watched him do all of this and said nothing because he was asking questions she respected. Finally, he straightened. "This won't stop cold," he said. "It's not meant to." He waited. "It will slow wind," she said. "That's enough." He looked back at the structure, the curve. "The wind doesn't come straight." He was quiet. "Then how do you know where it comes from?" She walked to the nearest post, to the length of yarn she had tied there in June, weathered now, still faintly moving in the light midday air. She said nothing. The yarn said it. Eli looked at the yarn for a long time. Then he said something she did not expect. He said, "Come with me," and walked back toward his horse. She followed, not because she was asked, but because curiosity in her experience was usually worth following. He reached into his saddlebag and drew out a journal, its cover dark with age and handling the binding repaired with a length of rawhide. He held it for a moment without opening it, the way a man holds something he has not looked at in a long time. "The war," he said, "the last winter. We were moving between positions in a storm and we lost 4 men, not to enemy fire, to distance, to disorientation." He paused. "I spent 2 months after that thinking about how to prevent it. I drew plans, systems, ways of connecting positions without exposing men to open ground." He opened the journal. The pages were dense with diagrams, cross-sections, measurements, notes in a small, precise hand. Clara looked at the drawings. She recognized the principle immediately, the same logic she had arrived at through her own observation, approached from a different direction. Flexible barriers, distributed resistance, connection without exposure. "You didn't build it," she said. "The war ended." She looked at the journal a moment longer, then looked up at him. "That was 20 years ago," she said. "Yes." The word carried something that was not quite regret and not quite acknowledgement, but existed somewhere between the two. It was the sound of a man who had understood something, set it aside, and was only now fully reckoning with what the setting aside had meant. Clara did not say anything more on that subject. She turned and walked back to her work. Eli stood at the fence for a moment longer, then he left. The children from the Deller farm found their way to her property one afternoon in late July, drawn by the structure the way children are drawn to anything that exists outside the categories they have been taught. The older one, a girl of perhaps 10, stood at the entrance and looked in. "What is it?" she asked. "A passage," Clara said. The girl walked in. Her voice changed the moment she crossed the threshold. The echo altered the ambient sound of the open plains, muted, replaced by something smaller and more contained. She said something to her younger brother still outside, and he heard it differently than he would have in the open air. He stepped in after her. Clara listened to the change in their voices and understood immediately what it measured. Sound moves the way air moves. If sound was contained, air was contained. She marked the sections where their voices rang most clearly. Those were the sections with the most consistent coverage. She marked where the sound went flat. Those were the gaps. She returned to those sections the following morning and added another layer. This was how the building worked. Not from a blueprint, but from attention. Not toward a fixed vision, but toward a response. By late August, the tunnel no longer looked like branches. It looked intentional, defined, shaped. It was not solid light still moved through the weave in patterns that shifted with the sun's angle, but it had acquired the particular presence of a thing made carefully over time. Willa Marsh came in the last week of August. She was different from her brothers in the way that some siblings are simply born pointed in a different direction. She was 38 years old, quiet, watchful, with the kind of intelligence that showed itself not in what she said, but in the precision of what she asked. She came on foot, which was unusual. She stood outside the tunnel for a long time, moving around its perimeter, crouching once to look at how the base met the ground. Finally, she said, "My brothers think you've lost your mind." "I know," Clara said. "I don't think that." Willa pressed her hand against the woven side, feeling the flex, the resistance, the way it moved and returned. She held her palm there for a moment. "It breathes," she said. Clara looked at her. It was the most accurate single description she had heard. "Yes," she said. "Will it hold in a real storm?" "I don't know yet. That's what winter is for." September brought the first cold nights. Not dangerous cold, measuring cold. Clara walked the tunnel each morning and evening in different conditions, tracking the relationship between outside and inside. The answers were not dramatic. The tunnel did not create warmth. What it did was subtler and more important, it created delay. The rate at which a human body would lose heat moving through the tunnel was less than crossing the same distance in the open. In large numbers, that difference meant very little. In a northern plains blizzard, when the body had limited reserves and no ability to stop that difference, was the entire question. October arrived with the first real wind sustained and cold pushing from the northwest for 3 days. Clara stood inside the tunnel during the worst of it and felt what it did. The structure flexed, the willow ribs moved and returned. The wind came through in the thinnest places but did not pass cleanly. It broke, divided by the weave, into dozens of smaller currents that arrived at her with less velocity, less capacity to strip heat from exposed skin. She walked the tunnel end to end, noting where the wind entered most strongly, and spent the following 3 days reinforcing those sections. More willow, more layering, mud applied where gaps were too small for additional weaving, dried, cracked, slightly reapplied. Nothing was finished. Everything was maintained. Eli Strand came again in the third week of November. He walked the tunnel's length, said nothing for a long time. Clara worked nearby, retensioning a section of lateral weave that had loosened during the last wind. "People have stopped laughing," he said. "I know. They haven't started respecting it either." "That comes after," Clara said. "After what?" "After the first time it works, when they need it to." He was quiet. Then he walked to the post at the midpoint of the tunnel, the post where the words were carved, and looked at it for a long moment. Thomas Voss, January 14th, 1886, 18 steps. "He was a stubborn man," Eli said. "Didn't like being told he couldn't do something." "No, he didn't. He would have walked out in that storm regardless of what you'd built." Clara stopped working. "I know that too," she said. The silence that followed was full of everything that had not been said in 14 months, the specific shape of grief that exists between people who shared someone and now share only the absence. Finally, Eli said, "Then who is it for?" Clara looked at the tunnel, then at the post, then at the distance between the cabin door and the silo. "For the next person," she said, "and the one after that." Eli nodded once, the slow, deliberate nod of a man committing something to memory. Then he walked back to his horse and rode south. Clara turned back to the tunnel and kept working because the season was almost gone, and what was not finished before the first storm would not be finished at all. The sky to the northwest had been building for 3 days. She had watched it the way she watched everything, not with fear, but with attention. It was the color and depth of something serious. She worked until the light left. Then she went inside. She was ready, not because she was certain it would hold, because she had done everything she knew how to do. And the difference between those two things, certainty and preparation, was something she had spent 14 months learning to live with. The first storm came on a Thursday. Clara knew it was Thursday because she had marked the days on the cabin wall with charcoal, the way she had done every winter since Thomas died. Small practices of orientation mattered when you lived in a place that could seal itself off from the world for days at a time. They kept the mind from drifting into the shapelessness that isolation combined with darkness and cold could produce in a person who stopped paying attention to themselves. Thursday, December 11th, 1887. The sky had been building for 3 days, not dramatically, just a slow thickening of the northwest horizon, a gradual deepening of the gray, a drop in temperature that was consistent rather than sharp each morning, a few degrees lower than the one before. She had used those 3 days. 6 crossings on Monday, 2 on Tuesday, 4 on Wednesday, each trip carrying something back, corn from the silo, a coil of rope, a spare axe handle stored there in September. She was not panicking. She was reducing her dependency on future crossings. Every trip made now was a trip she would not need to make under worse conditions later. Front-loading the cab before the cost increased. By Wednesday evening, the cabin held enough fuel for 12 days and enough food for 3 weeks. The storm arrived fully in the early hours of Thursday morning. By dawn, the world outside the cabin window was white, not the soft white of a moderate snowfall, but a white that was also gray and also moving, a white that erased distance and depth and direction. Visibility was perhaps 20 feet. The silo, which stood 60 feet away, was gone, absorbed into the whiteness as though it had never existed. Clara dressed 8, fed the stove. She put on her coat, her hat, her 2 pairs of gloves. She opened the inner door of the tunnel. The sound changed immediately. Outside, the wind was total, the kind of sound that entered your body through your chest as much as your ears. Inside the tunnel, that sound diminished. Not disappeared, she could still feel the structure responding to it, the willow moving in its subtle, continuous flex, but the character of it changed. It became something you could think beside rather than something you had to think through. She moved forward, hand trilling along the woven surface, reading the walls as she walked, not for guidance but for information. Pressure differentials, points where the outer weave was working harder than others. At the midpoint, she stopped. This was the section she had reinforced most heavily in October. She stood still and felt what the storm was doing here. The structure was moving. Yes, the willow ribs flexing in their mounts, responding to the pressure, outsea, absorbing it, distributing it. Snow had built against the outside of the tunnel along this section. Against, not inside. Against. That mattered enormously. She continued to the silo, retrieved what she needed, and returned. The entire crossing took perhaps 4 minutes. She arrived back inside the cabin with her hands cold but functional, her core temperature essentially unchanged. She set down what she had carried and stood before the stove for a moment. The heat was there. She had not spent it crossing. That was the system, not preventing cold, not eliminating the crossing, but reducing what each crossing cost. The storm did not stop on Thursday. It continued through Friday, through Saturday, through Sunday, intensifying on the second day, and then settling into a long, sustained pressure that tested not courage, but endurance. The wind dropped occasionally, briefly, only to return with renewed force from a slightly different angle, as if searching for weaknesses it had not yet located. On the 7th morning, Clara opened the cabin door and found it immovable. Snow had packed against the outside, not a drift, but a compacted mass shaped by the wind into something almost structural. She closed the door without forcing it because a damaged frame was a problem that outlasted the storm. She turned to the tunnel entrance, cleared the small accumulation inside, and stepped through. On the 9th day, the wind shifted. Clara was at the midpoint when it happened. She felt the shift before she understood it. A change in the pressure on her left side, a change in the sound, the direction of its source rotating in a way she could feel in her chest before she could name it. Northwest to west, northwest. She pressed her palm flat against the windward wall and held it there. The wall was moving more than it had been. The flex was deeper, the return slower. The weave was absorbing more energy, working harder than it had been designed to work. Not failure, she knew what failure felt like. She had tested sections to failure during construction, specifically to understand where the limits were. But hardworking stress at the edge of the margin she had built in. The question was whether it would hold for the duration. She did not know. And standing in that tunnel with the wind pressing against the wall beneath her palm, she let herself face what she had not allowed during construction, the possibility that she had been wrong, that the curve was wrong, the weave was wrong, the entire logic of it was wrong, and that she had spent 6 months and all her reserves of belief on a mistake. She stood with that fear for a long moment. Then she made her assessment. The wall was under stress. The wall was not failing. The flex was greater than designed, but the design had been built with margin. She had built past minimum tolerance because she had known she could not anticipate all conditions, and margin was the only protection against the ones she couldn't see coming. The margin was being used. That was what margin was for. She continued forward, reached the silo, returned. The passage was narrower in two places, the wind working through the gaps with more force than before. She moved carefully, not rushing, because rushing in confined space under load was how collapses began. She made it back. She sat near the stove for a long time, not warming her hands, just sitting. The fear was still there. She did not push it away. It was information the same as everything else telling her that the tunnel was being tested beyond its design parameters, and also that it had not failed. Both things at once. That was what honest assessment looked like. On the 11th day, Eli Strand arrived. Clara heard 3 slow, deliberate knocks, the knock of a man not sure he had the strength for more bone. She opened the door and found him in the narrow space outside, having followed the fence line from his property by feel. He was in bad condition. His coat was iced across the shoulders and chest, his face the color and texture of old wax, and one of his hands was bare, the glove lost somewhere in the crossing. The fingertips were dark in a way that needed immediate attention. She pulled him inside, sat him in the chair nearest the stove, close but not touching it, found his bare hand, and held it between both of hers, not rubbing damaged tissue that had begun to freeze, holding. Steady warmth transferred slowly, the correct and gradual woe. He did not speak for a long time. She watched the wax quality of his face give way to something more alive, the particular shift when blood finds its way back to the surface. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough. Followed the fence as long as I could, lost it about a quarter-mile out, found it again. A pause. Nearly didn't. You're here, Claire said. He looked at the tunnel entrance. He studied it with the focus of a man reassessing something he thought he had already understood. It's still standing, he said. Yes. He was quiet. Then I told people it would fail. Clara looked at him. Not because I believed it, he said, his voice steadying as the warmth returned. Because if they believed in it too early, if they trusted it before it had proven itself and it failed, they would have gone out in the storm, depending on something that wasn't ready. I was protecting the system from belief it hadn't earned yet. He met her eyes. I was also protecting you. If it failed and people had already trusted it, what happened after that would have fallen on you. Clara held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at the fire. I know, she said. She had understood this for weeks, the particular logic of a man who had seen trust misplaced and paid for it in lives. Eli had not been working against the tunnel. He had been protecting everyone from their own hope. She did not say this. It did not need to be said. After a long silence, Eli looked at the tunnel entrance. I want to go through it, he said, when you can stand without holding the chair. He almost smiled. Fair. 20 minutes later, he stood, crossed to the entrance, stepped in. Clara watched him from the cabin end, the way he placed his hand on the woven wall, once briefly at the point where the curve began, then let it drop and continued by feel and balance alone. He slowed at the midpoint the same way she always did not, because the structure required it, but because that was where you understood it most completely. He continued to the silo end. She heard the door open, heard it close, heard his footsteps returning steady, unhurried. He came back into the cabin and stood for a moment without speaking. Then quietly, with the weight of a man who does not spend words unless they are worth spending, it holds. Yes, Clara said. 2 words from him, 1 from her. Between them, everything that needed to be said. Cutter Marsh tried to cross on that same day, though Clara did not learn this until later. He had heard through the channels by which information moved across the plains, even in the depth of a storm. A rider between properties before conditions worsened. A message passed along a fence line during a brief morning lull that Clara's tunnel was standing, that she was crossing, that the structure he had laughed at in August was doing in December what nothing else in the surrounding farms could do. He wanted to see it. Not from simple curiosity, Cutter Marsh organized his understanding of the world around a clear hierarchy of competence, and he had placed Clara outside it. The tunnel's survival was a reclassification, and reclassification was uncomfortable in ways that practical facts alone sometimes were not. He set out from his property, moving south along the fence line toward her land. He made it perhaps 300 yards before the west-northwest shift. The same shift that had tested the tunnel on the 9th day dropped visibility to nothing. He lost the fence. He stood in the white with no reference in any direction and understood in the full bodily way that such understanding arrives what 18 steps meant. His brother Bram found him 20 minutes later, pulled him back to their cabin by the wrist, and said nothing for the rest of that day. Cutter said nothing either, but he had felt it, the white, the erasure, the way the storm did not distinguish between men who doubted and men who believed. On the 15th day, the storm began to change. Not to stop it, change first. The wind dropped from its sustained pressure to something more intermittent, gusting and pausing in a pattern that created false readings. Clara stood inside the tunnel during one of these pauses and listened. The structure around her was different from day one. Sections of the outer weave had compressed into greater density where snow had built and held. Other sections were looser where the wind had worked at the connections. The curve of the tunnel was slightly more pronounced than November, the accumulated pressure of the west-northwest wind having pushed the midpoint a few inches further south from its original position. She pressed her palm against the windward wall one final time. It had moved. It had been pushed. It had not broken. There was a difference between those things that was not merely technical. A wall that moved and held was a different kind of structure than one that stood rigid and then shattered. She had understood this as a principle when she began. She understood it now as fact demonstrated across 15 days of genuine testing, and she noticed something else, something she had not anticipated. The sections that had been reshaped by the pressure were stronger in the directions the real wind had actually pushed than her original design had been. The storm had improved the tunnel. She stood with that for a long moment because it changed something in her understanding of what she had built. She had designed for the wind she predicted. The tunnel had adapted to the wind that actually came. The two were not the same, and the difference between them was the difference between what a person can know in advance and what only time and pressure can reveal. She continued to the silo, returned, fed the fire, and sat down by the window. The silo was emerging from the white. Shapes were returning, the fence line first, then the corner of the outbuilding, then the silo itself, solid and unchanged 60 feet away. Reachable. She had not lost everything crossing. She had not lost anything crossing. She thought about Thomas, not with the sharp edge of immediate grief that had softened into something more like a chronic ache present and real, but no longer capable of stopping her. She thought about what he would have made of this winter, of the tunnel, of the specific fact that she had built it, And it had held. He would not have built it. She had told Eli that, and she believed it. Thomas's way had been directness, the conviction that preparation was for people who lacked nerve. He had crossed in storms before survived, and concluded he always would. That was the logic of a man who had survived his risks and attributed the survival to himself rather than to the favorable conditions that had made it possible. She did not blame him for it. It was a common logic, necessary even for people who chose to live in places like this. But there was a difference between confidence and preparation, and the difference was not visible until the conditions that made confidence insufficient finally arrived. They had arrived on January 14th, 1886, and they had arrived again this winter. The difference was that this time there was a tunnel. The storm finally broke on the 18th day. Not dramatically, it did not end so much as exhaust itself, the wind thinning over the course of a long gray afternoon until by evening, the air was still for the first time in nearly 3 weeks. The temperature remained severe, but the stillness after sustained wind felt almost warm by comparison, the body's relief at the absence of something that had been constant long enough to become invisible. Clara opened the cabin door the following morning and stepped outside. The landscape had been reorganized by the storm drifts, where there had been open ground where drifts had been the familiar geometry of the yard rearranged into something she would need to relearn. The tunnel stood in its place, compressed along the windward side, the outer weave dense with packed snow that had not penetrated the curve slightly altered from what it had been in November, but intact, continuous, connected from cabin door to silo door without a break. She walked its length from the outside for the first time since the storm began. She walked slowly, looking at every section, touching the weave in places where the compression was heaviest. She found 2 sections that had been pushed inward enough to narrow the passage significantly, and 1 section near the northwest entrance where the outer layer had separated from the inner layer under the sustained pressure of the shifted wind. These were not failures. They were the places where the storm had been most honest with her about what still needed work. She made notes. She would address them before the next storm. People came the following day, not all at once, in 2s and 3s on foot and on horseback from the farms and homesteads within a half-day's travel. They came the way people come to things that have survived something they were not sure would survive it, with the particular mixture of relief and reassessment that follows the revision of a firm opinion. Cutter Marsh came early before most of the others. He came on foot, which surprised Clara. He walked the length of the tunnel, slowly examining the windward side, pressing against sections, looking for the place where it should have given way. He did not find it. When he reached the silo end, he turned and walked back, looking up at the curve, this time, the subtle bend that he had not understood when he first saw it and had not thought to try to understand. He stopped near the midpoint and stood there for a moment. "I would have built it straight," he said. "I know," Clara said. There was no apology in his voice, and she did not expect one. What was there was something more valuable, the specific acknowledgement of a man who had reorganized his understanding and was telling her so directly. It was the most he was capable of, and it was enough. Gideon Deller arrived the day after. He had lost significant wood supply during the storm, not to theft, but to consumption, because his storage system required constant replenishment, and when the storm made replenishment impossible, the system simply ran down. He stood at the tunnel entrance and looked at it with the focused attention of a man who has recently been wrong about something important and is now doing the work of understanding why. "What is it made of?" he asked. "Willow," Clara said. "An observation, on time." He frowned at that. He was a man who preferred material answers. "The willow I can source. The other two take longer," she said. He looked at the tunnel. "I want to build one." "Not yet," she said. "Why not?" "Because you haven't watched a full season. You don't know where your wind comes from. You don't know where your snow builds. If you build before you know that you'll build straight, and straight will fail." He held her gaze for a moment, reassessing. Then he nodded. "When watch through spring, watch through summer, build in the fall." He nodded again slowly, the nod of a man accepting a timeline he didn't like but understood. He left without saying more. Willa Marsh came alone 2 days after the storm broke, as she had come in August on foot in the late afternoon with no particular announcement. She walked the outside of the tunnel, then stood near the entrance for a long time without speaking. "How did you know where to build it?" she finally asked. Clara shook her head slightly. "I did not know." Willa waited. "I watched," Clara said, "the yarn on the posts, the way the snow drifted against the silo wall in different storms, the way the children's voices sounded in different sections when they played inside." She paused. "I built toward what I observed, not toward what I expected." Willa was quiet for a moment. "Observation before action," she said. "Yes. That's not how most people build. No, most people build toward what they already believe. Then they're surprised when it fails." Willa looked at the tunnel for a long time. Then she turned and walked home in the fading light. In the weeks that followed, Eli Strand began building. He did not ask Clara for plans or measurements or advice. He had the journal from 1867, and he had 2 decades of his own observation of this land, and he had walked through Clara's tunnel in the middle of a blizzard and felt with his own hands what it did and how it did it. He built his tunnel from the same principle, but from his own understanding of it, which was necessarily different from hers because his land was different. His structures were arranged differently. His wind patterns were slightly different. He built slowly. He built the curve from watching where snow had accumulated against his barn over multiple winters, the pattern of those accumulations telling him what the wind had done repeatedly and therefore what it was likely to do again. He built the frame from willow. He cut himself from a stand along the eastern edge of his property. He applied the outer layers in sections, testing each before adding the next. When it was finished in the early weeks of February, he came to Clara. "Come see," he said. She went. She walked his tunnel from end to end. It was different from hers in the specifics, shorter the curve beginning earlier, and resolving more gradually the weave tighter along the upper section where his northwest exposure was more direct. She walked it slowly, not rushing, reading it the way she read her own. Near the midpoint, she stopped. She placed her hand against the windward wall, not to assess the flex, but because there was a point here where the outer layer seemed to draw inward slightly, a subtle irregularity in the tension. A potential weakness, the kind of thing that would show itself fully only under sustained lateral pressure. She stood with her hand there for a moment. The wall did not give under her palm. Someone had already added a second layer of horizontal weaving across this exact section, reinforcing precisely the point where the tension pattern suggested it was needed. She looked at Eli. He was watching her. He had seen her stop. He had known what she was checking. "I saw it before I finished," he said simply. Clara looked at the reinforced section for a moment longer. Then she nodded once, not approval, not praise, but recognition. The specific recognition of one person who has understood something deeply, acknowledging that another person has understood it too in their own way from their own direction. It was the most she had offered anyone. It was enough. Eli almost smiled. They walked back out into the winter air without saying more. The second winter tested what the first had built. The storms came earlier in December, the first significant one arriving before most farms had completed their preparations, which told Clara something she had suspected the previous winter had not been an exception. This was the pattern. The land did not moderate. It simply showed you a different face of the same fundamental character. Gideon Deller had spent the intervening months watching. He had staked yarn to posts at different heights around his property. He had tracked where snow accumulated after each storm, where it didn't, where the wind moved fast, and where it slowed. He had built nothing through the summer, which required more patience than most people in this valley could have maintained. In September, he began. He built differently from Clara and differently from Eli. Because his land was different from both of theirs, the silo positioned to the northeast of his cabin, rather than the south, the prevailing drift pattern, running along the east face of his barn rather than the west. He built low closer to the ground than either of the others had, because observation had shown him that his most dangerous wind carried ground-level snow rather than overhead. He built with more interior cross-bracing than Clara had used because his willow was slightly older and more brittle, and he compensated for the material's limitation with structural redundancy. His tunnel was not as elegant as Clara's. It was not meant to be. It was meant to work under his specific conditions, and it did. The second winter came, and the tunnels held. All of them. Not perfectly, Gideon's required repair after the third storm, when a section of the cross bracing failed under ice accumulation, and Eli's entrance drifted closed twice and had to be cleared each time. But they held. People moved when others could not. Supplies crossed. Wood was carried. The valley did not stop. One family at the far edge did not build. They had watched, considered, and ultimately decided that the previous winter had been unusual and outlier, not a pattern. On the fourth day of the second major storm, their wood ran dangerously low. On the fifth, the father and his eldest son attempted to reach their wood storage 40 feet from the house in a lean-to against the eastern fence. They did not make it all the way. They returned partially frozen alive, but changed in the way that a body changes when it understands in full what cold is willing to do. Eli reached them on the sixth day, crossing through his own tunnel, and then moving carefully between his property and theirs through a path he had partially cleared in the calmer days before the storm intensified. He brought wood, he brought food. He stayed 2 hours and then returned. When he told Clara about it afterward, he said it simply, "The tunnel didn't just help me, it let me help them." Clara nodded. She had understood this possibility without quite having articulated it, that a system built for one person's survival would, if the person who built it was willing, extend further than its original purpose. Systems did that. People forgot to account for it when they were building because they were focused on their own need, which was the right focus during construction. But afterward, the system became something larger than the need that had created it. Spring came the way it always came here without asking permission, turning the frozen ground soft in the space of 2 weeks, the drifts collapsing from their edges inward, the creek running fast and brown with snowmelt. The landscape reemerged from its winter form, revealing what the season had done to it and what it had not been able to do. Clara's tunnel showed the winter's work clearly. The windward side was compressed and dense, the outer weave packed hard with the residue of storm snow that had not penetrated but had shaped itself against the structure's surface. The curve was more pronounced than it had been in November 1887, pushed further by the second winter storms into a form that bore the visible record of 2 years of weather. 2 sections needed significant repair. Several smaller sections needed attention. She looked at it for a long time the morning she made her full assessment. Eli came by that afternoon. He stood beside her and looked at the tunnel without speaking for several minutes, the way he always did, the way that meant he was thinking rather than waiting. "You're not going to repair it," he said. Not a question. "All of it." He looked at her. "It already did what it needed to," she said. She gestured without pointing, a general indication of the surrounding valley toward where Eli's tunnel stood, toward where Gideon Deller's stood, toward the marsh property, where Cutter had built one the previous fall, without asking anyone for help or plans, simply by watching what the others had done and applying the principle to his own land. "It taught them," Eli said. "They taught themselves," Clara said. "I just built something they could look at." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You were not building a tunnel." She looked at him. "You were building a way to lose less," he said. Clara held that for a moment. It was the clearest statement of what she had done that she had ever heard, clearer than anything she had found words for herself. Lose less, not gain more, not add protection, add strength, add resources. Simply reduce what was being taken. Start from the subtraction rather than the addition and work from there. "Yes," she said. Eli nodded once satisfied. They stood in the early spring light looking at the valley. 6 tunnels visible from where they stood, Eli's, Gideon's, Cutter's, and 3 others built by families who had watched and understood and applied the principle in their own way. Each one different in its specifics, each one built from the same idea. The post still stood at the midpoint of Clara's tunnel. The winter had driven it slightly deeper into the softening ground, but the carving was intact, the words still legible. Thomas Voss, January 14th, 1886. 18 steps. She had not removed it. She would not. The post was not a monument to grief, though grief had been the beginning of all of this. It was a measurement. It was the original fact from which everything else had followed, the observation of a specific distance at which the familiar became fatal, the understanding that the problem was not cold and not weather, but the absence of a system for crossing the space between two fixed points without dying. The system existed now. 6 versions of it, each one shaped by different observations in different conditions in different hands. Each one imperfect in its own ways, each one adequate to the actual demands of the actual winter. Not one of them was finished. All of them would require attention in the spring repair through the summer adjustment before the next winter came. That was not failure. That was maintenance. And maintenance was the difference between a system that held and a system that had once held. In the early weeks of May, when the ground was soft enough to work, Gideon Deller came to Clara to say that he had started teaching his neighbors to the south, a family named Alcott, who had arrived the previous summer, who had no experience of winters like this, and had survived the second one by luck and the generosity of those around them. He was showing them where to plant the yarn, where to watch, what questions to ask of the land before you started building anything. I told them what you told me, he said, that the material doesn't matter as much as the understanding, that the understanding comes from watching, not from building. Clara nodded. They want to talk to you, he said. They don't need to, she said. They have you. He looked at her for a moment, understanding what she meant. Then he nodded and left. The children came back that spring, the Deller children and others, the ones who had played in the tunnel the previous summers. They were older now, a year and 2 years older, which in children of that age is a significant distance. They ran through the tunnels without hesitation, without looking, without any of the conscious attention that the adults brought to the crossing. For them, the tunnels were simply part of the landscape structures, as ordinary as the fence lines and the outbuildings features of the world they had always known. Clara watched them from the cabin door one afternoon in late May. Eli came up beside her. They stood together, watching the children move through the tunnels. Not Clara's, which was partially unmaintained now, but Eli's piece and Gideon's and Cutter's, the ones that were still fully active, still being maintained, still crossing. They don't know what it cost, Eli said. No, Clara said, they don't need to. He looked at her. What they need to do, she said, is build further. And they will, because for them, this is the starting point, not the achievement. Eli was quiet for the moment. Thomas would have been proud of you, he said. Clara watched the children run. Thomas would have tried to cross without it, she said, and he would have made it, and he would have told everyone the tunnel was unnecessary. Eli made a sound that was almost a laugh. That's why it wasn't built for Thomas, Clara said. It was built for the person who didn't have Thomas's luck. The spring evening light lay long across the plains. The post still stood. The tunnel still stood. The children ran through them and came out the other side. The valley held more than it had 2 years before. Not more land, not more resources, not more favorable conditions, more understanding, more systems, more people who had looked at a problem honestly and built something imperfect and maintained it and improved it and taught what they'd learned to the next person. That was what remained. Not the willow which would rot, not the mud which would crumble, not even the specific curve of the original tunnel, which had already shifted from what it had been when Clara first drove the stakes. What remained was the principle: reduce what is taken, build flexible, maintain rather than declare finished, observe before you act. And when what you have built is no longer needed, look around and count the things it made possible, because that is the true measure of what anything was worth. The light faded. The children went home. Clara turned from the door and went inside. She fed the stove. She sat. She watched the heat rise and noted how long it remained and made a small adjustment to the damper and noted the result and filed it away with everything else she had learned and was still learning because the learning did not stop when the crisis did. The learning stopped when you decided you were finished. She was not finished. She was never finished. And that was precisely why everything she built continued to hold.